Noguchi and Hiroki walked into a room filled with low, nervous chatter and grim faces. The gathered ranchers and Chigusa staff fell silent and looked at them, their expressions fearful and expectant. The rec centre was packed, but suddenly 100+ people didn't seem like so many. Noguchi cleared her throat. "Before we start, is everyone here?" Mason stood from his seat near the door and read from a piece of paper. "Everyone except Ikeda, both Revners, 3 ops people, 2 of Marianetti's people are on their way, and the Sheldons. Oh, and the Barkers haven't answered yet." Noguchi nodded. "Ikeda will be here shortly, and Miriam Revner is tending to Bobby Sheldon." A slender blonde woman called out from the back corner of the room, her voice tinged with worry. "Is it true? About the Sheldons?" Noguchi recognized her as one of the garbage maintenance workers, a mechanic. Noguchi took a deep breath. She and Hiroki had discussed how to handle the situation after Ikeda had called in, but it wasn't going to be easy. The Sheldons had apparently been well liked on Ryushi. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I'll tell you what we know," she said. She consciously kept her voice low and firm. Panic in the crowd would help no one. "Approximately 2 hours ago, Bobby Sheldon came into town on a flyer, alone. He said that his parents had been killed by a group of XT life forms. Just before he arrived, Spanner and Ikeda found an injured being in Iowa Gorge that is currently unconscious in the med center. Bobby Sheldon identified this being as similar to the life forms that killed his parents." Noguchi took another deep breath. "When we were unable to reach Mr. and Mrs. Sheldon by radio, we sent Ashley Ikeda on a flyby. I'm sad to report that she just called in with the news that the Sheldon house is in flames and their breeding stock has been slaughtered. We must assume that an attack is imminent." There was a slight murmur through the crowd. A few people coughed. A few children started to cry softly. Lauren Gaunt, one of the Ops widescreen watchers, stood and raised his voice to be heard above the uneasy group. "So what are we going to do with the thing in the med center? And what is it exactly?" Several others nodded. Hiroki stepped forward. "At this time, we know very little about the creature currently in Miriam Revner's care. It is a large humanoid being, unlike anything previously registered in the EXT guide. It is under restraint and has shown no signs of recovering so far, although Revner doesn't seem to think it's in critical condition." "You mean you haven't killed it?" Gaunt sounded incredulous. "After it murdered Bob and Sylvan?" A couple of others called out agreement. Noguchi raised a hand for silence. "The creature in the med center was not involved in their deaths. The time frame..." "Fuck the time frame," said Gaunt. "For all we know, that thing was responsible for sending its buddies out to murder them." The calls of agreement were shouts now. Noguchi felt that spark of anger she'd had for Ackland. She clapped her hand sharply above her head and yelled, "Be quiet!" The room quieted. An infant howled loudly in the back and was soothed by its mother. "Perhaps if we all panic and turn ourselves into mindless animals, we'll get out of this situation. Who else wants to add to the problem?" Her voice carried well. She could feel her cheeks flushed with anger and was gratified to see that Gaunt's were also red. He dropped his gaze to the floor and didn't speak again. Noguchi nodded. She had everyone's attention. A young boy raised his hand. "Yes." "Is Bobby okay?" The boy was no more than 12. His voice was high and shaky, obviously upset by the situation. His father placed a hand on the child's shoulder. She nodded and attempted to smile. "He has a sprained ankle and he's in shock, but he'll be all right. Squires has agreed to watch him for a while." Noguchi motioned at the young teacher, who chewed nervously at her lip. She scanned the room, watched the fearful crowd with a calm eye. "This is bad, but we will handle it." She felt in control, for once. The people of Ryushi looked at her to tell them what to do. She wouldn't let them down. "If we could hold other questions for a few moments, I'll tell you what we propose. Mr. Shimura is in charge of security. All able-bodied personnel will be expected to take a shift on watch. Anyone not on duty will remain within the main complex. First, we'll do what we can to barricade the town with the cargo crates from the move here." She nodded at Mason. "Mason here will head up that maneuver. Anyone trained on lift equipment will report to him after the meeting. There is a 33-hour curfew in effect as of now. No one will go anywhere alone unless they've cleared it with me or Hiroki, and it will have to be a good reason. Those of you with weapons, please list them with Spanner ASAP. Ben Davidson and Jess Johnson have volunteered to show our younger members holovid graphics at the school this afternoon, so meet with them afterwards for specific times. People nodded. She could almost feel the fear in the room become less tangible. It was a good thing to remember that most crises just needed some organisation and clear thinking to be handled efficiently. Hiroki read from a list the first watch team, and then suggested another meeting later, at dusk or when the work was finished, whatever came first. As the gathering drew to a close, Noguchi was pleased to see the order and confidence that had been restored quickly after Gaut's outburst. Except only a few people had heard what Bobby Sheldon had said, or seen what the thing in the lab looked like. Noguchi shook her head. It didn't matter. Wishing for other circumstances was pointless. She took a deep breath and went outside to do what she could. Twilight was almost there when it occurred to Noguchi that she hadn't heard back from Collins. Under Hiroki's capable direction, they'd set up an admirable line of defence. The house-sized moving crates had been lined up around the perimeter of the compound quickly, and with the willing aid of both the ranchers and the staff, the work had been neatly done. A copter crew had made runs to fetch all of the weapons listed by the ranchers. Noguchi had felt her heart sink at the inventory. 27 scatterguns, 10 pistols earmarked for a police force that had never been needed, and 6 old-fashioned flare guns. There was also a few hunting rifles and handguns. Not much. She sat in the ops centre, hunched over a cup of black coffee that was barely tepid. Her body ached from all of the work. Hiroki had insisted that she take 5, and she was only too glad to comply. Hiroki was going to take a team to walk the compound and secure any place they had missed. Around her, 4 staffers watched screens. Noguchi was exhausted, and there was still so much to do. Too many variables to consider. Like the Lecter. Noguchi straightened. The crew outside was just finishing up, and another meeting was coming up within the hour. But had she seen anyone from the ship? That obnoxious Conover? Weaver, have you seen Collins anywhere? The tall, dark-haired staff woman looked up from her console. No, I haven't at least. Downey, have you seen Collins? Sid Downey shrugged. No one's seen him since he went to talk to the Lecter's people. Noguchi sighed and stood up reluctantly. Any progress? Downey shook his head. The Barkers still don't answer, and Dr. Revner refuses to be moved from the main building. Other than that, everyone's accounted for. Noguchi patted him on the shoulder as she walked towards the door. Keep up the good work. I'm going to talk to the Lecter folks, see if they've kidnapped Collins. She almost collided with Hiroki in the doorway. Where are you going? Hiroki looked like she felt. Dark smears of dust painted his face, and his eyes looked weary and old. Collins still hasn't come back from the ship. I'm going to find out what's going on with him. But first, I'm going to see if I can talk some sense into Dr. Revner. Hiroki frowned. It's not safe, Machiko. His tone was gentle. She felt oddly touched by his concern, but she was also tired of not knowing what the hell the ship was up to. Someone has to go. May as well be me. Hiroki looked at her seriously for a beat, and then unhooked his holster strap. He handed over the revolver to her, but first. I see you've made up your mind, but take this. It's a 12.5mm Smith. It belonged to my grandfather. It's loaded with jacketed bullets for hunting big game. She stared at the weapon. He pushed it into her hands. If you have to shoot something, make sure it has a thick wall behind it. These bullets will go right through a Rinth. I'll call the sentries and let them know you're on your way. Noguchi accepted the weapon gingerly and nodded. She knew how to shoot, of course. It was SOP for off-world execs to take a course. Never knew what you'd run into on the frontier. For once, the company was right. Fine. Have Weaver set up the sat link as soon as the sun sets, and ask them to cut a deal for marine support. She smiled tiredly. And thanks, Hiroki. Be careful. He smiled in return. You're doing a good job, Machiko. She walked into the late afternoon heat and headed for the med center, her thoughts jumbled with exhaustion. There was still a crew of a dozen or so outside, setting the final walls into place. Amazing that in the space of a day, they'd gone from peaceful town to armed camp. The gun was heavy in her hands. She paused long enough to strap the holster on and settle it on her hip. Still heavy, but comforting. She wanted desperately to believe that their measures were needless, but her gut told her otherwise. Tired though she was, there was a chilling certainty in her bones that tonight would be a long one, and come morning, things might be very different. Miriam watched the stats on the screen with something like awe. She was glad to have something to do beside worry over Kazar, and the alien was distracting, to say the least, now that Bobby had gone. Her stomach tightened at the thought of her husband. She'd always thought that she would know what if he was gone, that deep knowing that two people shared if enough years had passed. But there was nothing. She just missed him. She kept thinking of what he would say about the incredible reads that flashed across the console. Doctor? Revna turned in her chair, heart pounding. Miss Noguchi. The attractive Japanese woman smiled gently. I'm sorry, we haven't heard anything. The doctor took a deep breath. Then you've come to check in on the patient. She tilted her head towards the prone form on the exam table nearby. He's still not awake, but he's making remarkable progress. His respiration has deepened, but I believe that 2 of his ribs have begun to heal. The gentle smile never left Noguchi's face. The obvious sympathy there made Revna want to cry, so she turned back to the screen. I'll let you know if he regains consciousness, she said. Doctor, I'd like to move you and our visitor to the main complex. The security is better there and... Thank you, no, said Revna. I prefer to remain here. I have everything I need to look after my patient. She hoped she sounded collected and normal, but she heard her voice crack slightly on the truth. Besides, this is where Kazar will come when he returns. She didn't turn around, but she sensed the Noguchi woman's hesitation. Before, they could have hoped for an accident, with her husband lying injured, waiting for help. But now, Revna could almost hear her thoughts, that she was fooling herself. Kazar Revna had undoubtedly met the same fate as Bobby's parents. He had gone right to where the wrecked ship lay. Miriam spoke again, her voice firmer this time. I'm fine, Miss Noguchi, really. Very well, Doctor, she said. I'll check back on you later. Thank you, Miss Noguchi, Machiko. When she heard the door close, Revna finally relaxed a bit. A lone tear trickled down her cheek. She wiped at it absently and concentrated on the task at hand. He would be back soon, and if he wasn't, she would find him somehow. Mason rolled his head and yawned. He and Riley had run out of things to say about 20 minutes ago. The initial adrenaline of the situation was long gone, and their nervous small talk had disintegrated into a watchful silence. At least it wouldn't get any hotter today. The suns were headed down. And in another hour or so, he and Riley would be inside drinking beer and shooting the shit. He pitied the next watch. Being out here after dark would be a bitch. Hi, Riley. Hi, Mason. The boss lady walked toward them smoothly, a smile of greeting on her lips. Speak of the devil. Riley nodded back, and Mason stepped forward. He dropped his cigarette on the dusty ground and squashed it with one boot. Miss Noguchi, he said politely. Mr. Shimura said you were coming. I'm to escort you to the lector? Let me guess, Mason. Hiroki ordered you to follow me even if I decline your escort. Yes, ma'am. She nodded and sighed. Well, come on then. She stepped ahead of him and headed down towards the ship. Mason glanced over his shoulder to see Riley grinning at him and shot him the finger. Smarmy bastard. He jogged to catch up to Noguchi and walked in front of her. This would be a prime opportunity to tell the management what he'd been thinking. You know, I think we're worrying too much. I mean, look at the size of the complex. You need an army to attack, right? He looked back at Noguchi and stopped at the base of the ramp for her to catch up. She didn't answer, didn't even look at him really. He might as well have been talking to a block of plasticrete. I think those XTs are going to take one look at Prosperity Wells and go back home, he continued. Fuck her anyway. He stepped into the open door at the top of the ramp and pointed his scattergun at nothing in particular. It was dark in there. He took another step inside and then turned his head to call back to the Ice Queen. Just give me a second to get the lights. He edged to the left and groped blindly with one hand. Something wet dripped on his hand. Hey, he said under his breath. Another drop of warm liquid splashed the top of his head. fucking disgusting. Where were the goddamn light switches anyway? He got the impression of sudden movement overhead, and then there was only pain. Noguchi stood at the top of the ramp and listened to Mason babble mindlessly. Mason was something of a jerk, that was certain. He stepped into the dark and fumbled for the lights, still chattering away. She turned to look at him, just in time to see him lifted straight up into the darkness. There was a strangled, wet cry, and the darkness rushed forward to greet her, a dozen arms and 1,000 teeth all screaming, all hungry.